I am part of a growing coalition within the Jewish community and beyond the Jewish community that is seeking a just situation between Israel and Palestine. And I think particularly in the Jewish community, there I see the awakening of a willingness to tolerate a level of discussion that has heretofore been seen as off limits. The Jewish community is my native habitat. I'm a pulpit rabbi. I work in a nice suburban middle-class Jewish congregation, JRC in Evanston. We have about 530 households. The fact that I continue to work as a rabbi and continue to work in my primary role as a congregational rabbi in the community uh, gives me heart. It helps me feel like we can start to have conversations that were considered forbidden before. Growing up, I'm from the West Coast originally. I'm from Southern California. I grew up in Santa Monica. And I would say my own identification as a Jew was almost from the beginning as a Zionist and with the state of Israel at the center. My family identified as Zionist. I visited Israel with my family when I was 10 or 11 for the first time. We have many family members in Israel, and I have many friends there. When I started to rediscover my own Judaism in my own way and on my own terms, Zionism, and particularly liberal Zionism, was really at the center of it. It was a large part of my own excitement about Jewish life. I identified Zionism as a kind of national liberation movement of the Jewish people, and the mythic story of the Zionist movement and the birth of the state of Israel is a very powerful story. It speaks very profoundly and has to generations of Jews now. Even secular Jews, I think it has religious power for secular Jews, I would say. It certainly did for me. It's a redemptive story, right? It's a story of a people, a horribly persecuted people who have just experienced the Holocaust and this new liberation, the state of Israel born out of the ashes of the Holocaust. And it was, I think the redemptive nature of that story spoke very deeply to me. I will pause and say that I use that term religious very consciously. I do think that Zionism has been for decades now, maybe even the better part of a century, the civil religion of American Jews. I think that even for secular Jews, it has a religious power, and there are lots of examples of that. In the early days, the Reform movement, for instance, was anti-Zionist. I'm sure many of you know this, that the Reform movement, for religious reasons, opposed political nation-statism in Palestine, but eventually came around to accepting Zionism as well. And today, all of the major denominations are quite Zionistic. And if you look at for instance, one example is if you look at the prayer book of all of the major denominations, Reform, Reconstructionist, Conservative, Orthodox, if you look in these prayer books, you'll find something called the Prayer for the State of Israel, Tfilah leMedinat Yisrael, and it is a text that was written by the chief rabbi of Israel in 1948 after the establishment of the state. And the opening line is very famous, and it refers to Israel as Reshit Smichat Geulatenu. Israel is the first flowering of our redemption. And this is a religious prayer that is in all of the major American Jewish denominations' prayer books. So I think that speaks very powerfully to how deeply embedded Zionism is in the psyche of American Judaism. If you go to most synagogues in the United States and you go into the sanctuaries of these synagogues and you look at the Eastern Wall, I would say still probably the majority of them, you will see the Aron Kodesh, the Ark, where the Sefer Torah, the Torah scroll, our most sacred book, is housed. And on either side of the Ark, you'll find an American flag and an Israeli flag. And it's so common that I don't think we stop to think about what that really means. I mean, these symbols are right next to our most sacred text. We pray toward it. We bow in this direction, and it has a sacred power. Israel, the Israel story and Zionism is very much, I think, deeply embedded in the civil religious identity of American Jews. I think that's starting to unravel a bit. I'll talk a little bit about that later as well. But it certainly was for me. And at the same time, I think I know now that I had these nagging doubts about all of this. And I did my best. I did a very good job of keeping these doubts at bay. But I can look back and realize that they were fairly constant. I entertained now and then these thoughts about, well, what is this business of Jewish political nationalism and creating an ethnically Jewish state in this part of the world that has traditionally been so multi-ethnic and multi-religious? And what does this mean what does a Jewish state mean? A state that is so radically dependent on maintaining a demographic ethnic majority of Jews in order for it to be a viable Jewish state. And many liberal Jews, liberal Zionists, will talk about this very openly. We'll talk about the importance of a two-state solution, not necessarily from a moral point of view, that the Palestinians deserve a state of their own, but really from a demographic point of view. You hear this a great deal, that with the Palestinian birth rate, that we need a two-state solution because Palestinians pose a quote-unquote demographic threat to the integrity of the Jewish state. And every now and then I'd sort of stop and think, the Palestinians are a demographic threat to the integrity of a Jewish state? I mean, as an American, I would never dare say such a thing about any ethnic group. What does it mean to advocate for a kind of a nationalism that's predicated on having a racial majority within certain borders? And I would entertain those thoughts and then just sort of retreat back. Usually the way I would deal with those questions is, well, it's very complicated. Those words are, I think, come very easily to our lips, that we deal with very painful issues by retreating into the complexities of the situation. So I think for the first 10, 15 years of my rabbinate, I really dealt with Israel through avoidance, by and large. I would talk a great deal about the importance of a two-state solution and supporting the peace process, even though in my gut I started to feel like there was something hollow there. But it really wasn't until Operation Cast Lead that my defenses finally just sort of broke on this issue. And I remember very vividly, it was December 28th, 2008, and I was reading the first news reports of Israel's massive military assault into Gaza. And the initial ones were in Gaza City, by and large, in the north part of the Gaza Strip. And there were about 250 people killed in that first military operation. And I was reading about bodies lying in the streets and police cadets at a graduation ceremony who were just wiped out, and including children. And and all of this going on in a tiny strip of land, a 140 square mile patch of land with 1.5 million people in it, who had nowhere to run, which was blockaded. I read this and I was just stunned. And I realized that I had passed a kind of a Rubicon. I couldn't continue to deal through avoidance or with platitudes, and so then this conversation carried on. And what happened was, in addition to carrying on these conversations, is for me, all those voices that I kept locked in those lock boxes, that I shushed over the years, I just let them out. Because this wasn't really just about Gaza and Hamas and rocket fire. This was something that stretched back much, much farther, back to the origins of Zionism, really. And so all of the doubts that I entertained, I started to entertain very publicly. And I got involved in a few different ad hoc initiatives with other rabbis who were kindred spirits of mine on this issue. I realized that where I belonged as a Jew was standing with Palestinians. And I refused, I'll read you a post in a second where I address this. I refused the zero-sum approach of you stand with us, you stand against us. That as a Jew who believes that his spiritual tradition demands that I stand with the oppressed, that the most important thing I could do as a Jew would be to stand with Palestinians. And I believed, as I put it in that post, that my Jewish liberation was intrinsically bound up with Palestinian liberation. And I found that you can do that. And I've found that you can do that and remain in the Jewish community. It's been very difficult. It's been a lot of work, and it never ends. I'm sure that I know that there are always members of my congregation. I have lost some members, but not that many. I've gained members because of my activism, most certainly. I know there are still members who are deeply pained by what I do. I never pretend to speak for my congregation when I speak about this issue in public. And it's an ongoing process of really trying to find a way forward that I can be there for them as their rabbi in a pastoral sense. But at the same time, as a rabbi, I need to follow my prophetic role as speaking my conscience and what is often called speaking truth to power as I understand it. These were Jewish movements that were consciously rejecting the approach of the rabbis of traditional Judaism and saying that this has brought nothing but persecution to the Jews, and the only way Jews would ever be safe was to have a nation of our own. And Mazel Tov, So putting your faith in nationalism to keep you safe, I think we're realizing that that was a bit of a Faustian bargain, that maybe even a kind of idolatry, as I believe the rabbis would have it. Putting a national symbol next to the Aron Kodesh, next to the Ark, I think is fairly problematic in all kinds of ways. And so I've been doing a lot of writing that's trying to take the attitude of the rabbis and their response to empire and to militarism and to political movements and sort of update it for the 21st century. Because I think with Zionism, I think we too easily threw out the baby with the bathwater. In other words, I believe my Jewish liberation to be intrinsically bound up with Palestinian liberation. It's really that simple. But of course, there is nothing simple or uncomplicated about it. To take such a step is deeply painful in many ways. It means, among other things, facing down my people's own potential for oppression, to admit that the state of Israel, born in the wake of persecution, has itself become a persecutor. However, I must also admit that this pain, uncomfortable though it is nothing compared to the pain being experienced by the Palestinian people on a daily basis. Any person of privilege who stands in solidarity with the oppressed would do well to bear this in mind. While we must explore our own guilt and culpability, we must also bear in mind that it is not ultimately about us. And so today I'll take this opportunity to say that I stand in solidarity with the Palestinian people, but I'm not saying so to assuage my Jewish pain and guilt, nor to claim that I personally know how this liberation must eventually be achieved. In the end, I stand here because I know in my heart it is where I must be. I am finding increasingly, and one of the most heartening things about the work that I'm doing is the sheer numbers of young Jewish people who identify powerfully as Jews and are motivated by Jewish values, but are kept at bay by the Jewish community on the issue of Israel and Palestine. And Jewish Voice for Peace is an example of an organization that is attracting young people. There are others as well who are working in solidarity with non-Jews, with young Palestinians all over the country, all over the world, really, to build a new kind of movement, a new kind of coalition. And that question that I asked, well, what do I do now? I think where I stand is in coalition with a rapidly growing movement of solidarity that includes very unlikely, heretofore unlikely people, such as myself. And I feel very much at home there, I have to say. In many ways, it grieves me to say that in the institutional world of the Jewish community, I feel far less at home. I think after the Holocaust, Jewish liberation has largely been defined as Jewish survival, Jewish physical survival. And I understand that. I understand psychologically and maybe even spiritually why that would be the case. You read a lot of the post-Holocaust theologians, people like Irving Greenberg and Emil Fackenheim and others, Elie Wiesel. If some of these names mean something to you, there is a strong strain of the most important response to the Holocaust is to affirm Jewish survival at all costs. Am Yisrael Chai, that the people of Israel live. And again, when you've just been to the abyss of possibly being wiped out, I understand how that can be the case. But I also believe that if you hold on to that as your redemptive paradigm exclusively, it leads you down a very dark road. That means your survival at the expense of all else and all others. And I don't believe that we can ultimately find liberation through that paradigm. And when I talk about Jewish liberation, I talk about liberation from a spiritual point of view, which is what I believe that Judaism has always been about. And the rabbis for the holiday of Hanukkah designated the Haftarah, the prophetic portion from the book of Zechariah that said, not by might and not by power. And that is the paradigm of spiritual liberation that I believe is at the center of the rabbinic vision. That liberation is not tied to militarism, it's not tied to even physical survival, that if we focus on spiritual liberation and on transcendent values, that our survival will take care of itself. And I think by switching my own paradigm to standing with the oppressed, which is a time-honored Jewish directive, I believe, that goes back to our most central story, the Exodus story, that I am fulfilling the liberatory vision of my spiritual tradition. And I think all great traditions. I think Netanyahu is through and through a revisionist Zionist. And I think what he's doing today is very much in keeping with that ideology. Jabotinsky, who was the father, Vladimir Zev Jabotinsky was the father of revisionist Zionism, talked about an iron wall, between Jews and Arabs. And what we're seeing now is, in many ways, sort of a 21st century version of that. And not only the building of the wall, the actual wall, but no, I don't think he has any interest in a two-state solution. I think it's very clear to me what he's interested in, because he's doing it. He's doing it in the light of day. He is, I'll use the term, ethnically cleansing Area C of Palestinians through home demolitions and revoking residency rights and forcible eviction and military harassment. And he's pretty much completed it. I mean, it's pretty much done. So, no, I don't think he's interested in a two-state solution. I think what he's interested in, he's doing. And that's why, to me, the peace process is so empty, because the various players who are trying to shepherd this peace process are not doing anything to stop, have not done anything to stop this process. And now it's pretty much done. Those are the facts on the ground. Was there a spiritual crisis and that in some way involved decoupling Zionism from Judaism? Absolutely. I mean, that's, to me, what this is about. And that was the core of my crisis, because Zionism was my Judaism. And I realized how religiously I bought into it in ways that I never really even stopped to consider. And one of the things I'm working on now that it may be another book someday, I don't know, but is creating a theology, a Jewish spiritual vision that in many ways was my answer to your question, which is rooted in what I understand the values of traditional Judaism, diaspora-centered Judaism, this brave tradition that after the destruction of the temple and the dispersal of Jews all over the world made some very remarkable decisions in reconstructing a tradition that would allow it to thrive wherever Jews were. And these mighty empires came and went, and Jews are still there, and what does it mean that Zionism just threw all of that out and rejected that? And what would it mean to reaffirm that in a 21st century context in an era largely of Jewish power and privilege? And so those are the things I think a great deal about, and I find personally very meaningful and very fruitful. I think there's a lot to work with on those issues, and so Most of my writing lately, my private writing, has been on trying to come up with a Jewish theology of liberation, and that might speak to to other Jews who struggle in similar ways.
How do you understand history? Who controls the message? Is the media muzzled, lazy, confused, manipulated? How do you create personal and political change? I invite you to join me in exploring one of the most pressing and complex issues of our day.
In 1948, there was a lot of fighting around our house.
My eldest sister was shot.
A bullet come over our heads.
In 1967, I would call it the transformation from childhood to hell.
After the 67 war, if you weren't physically in the place where you were, you had no right to live in that place.
They're Palestinians, refugees.
This can't go on for much longer. People's eyes are beginning to open to what Israel's doing.
My name is Alice Rothschild, and I was born in 1948 in Boston. I'm an American Jew, interestingly enough, born the same year that the State of Israel was founded. My parents were first-generation Americans who instilled in us a sense that Jews were a distinct and often endangered tribe. This Jewishness soon became grounded in our love for Israel. But as I grew up, I realized I had never actually met an Arab before, and I only knew one side of this complex historical narrative. Starting in the 1990s, I began an active search for the voices that I had never heard, meeting and listening to dissenting Israelis, Palestinians, other Arabs in the United States. And then in 2003, I started co-organizing delegations to Israel, the West Bank, and Gaza, and meeting with Israelis and Palestinians in the region. I began to hear the enormous human commonalities between Arabs and Jews. And I also had to confront the trauma and the fear that pulses in my own Jewish DNA. Based on these experiences, I wrote a book, and then I began collecting stories of Palestinians who had come to the United States. I knew that May 14, 1948 was the glorious day that the State of Israel was founded. This was a victory over anti-Semitism and the Nazi Holocaust. For Palestinians, that day is called Al-Nakba, the catastrophe. The interviews with Palestinians that I will share with you in this film are the invisible voices that we have never heard. They are the other part of our story.
I come from a village called Al-Qubab. It's one of those villages, the 400 and some that in 1948 were totally demolished. I lived through the exodus from the village in late April, early May 1948.
It happened when I'm younger. I remember it exactly. When in 1948, my father came home and he told my mother that there is a neighbor across the street from us was killed. And he said, by the evening, by 6 o'clock, we have to go. So he get the whole family in the taxi. I remember running. I said, just can I take my doll? I love to take this little doll with me. And he said, just run and get it. And my mom, she has a baby, 15 days old. So she grabbed her jewelry, wrap it in the receiving blanket of the baby, and she throws all in the car, and we left.
For centuries in Eastern Europe, Jews were victimized by anti-Semitism and pogroms, and this all culminated in the Nazi Holocaust. So for Jews, being victimized by an outside Christian culture, it's part of our core identity. We all feel like we all experienced the Holocaust, and we all survived the Holocaust. For Palestinians, the Nakba is also a huge catastrophe. But for Palestinians, there has never been an opportunity to have closure on this trauma.